Good morning, everyone. Before I get into the message that I want to share with you this morning, I wanted to talk a little bit about some really neat things that are coming up for Hesta Mennonite. Of course, you know that you have a new pastor coming in August, but there is also going to be a little different focus on the month of May, in which I asked Clayton to consider if he would preach every Sunday, not so much to give me a break, because I really haven't been preaching that much. I just want to see him have that opportunity, and I'd like to have our worship commission be able to build our services around that. So look for more information about that as you go through this coming week. And then when we get to June and on Pentecost Sunday, Michelle Armster of Mennonite Central Committee from the Central States Office here in North Newton, she's going to be with us to bring the message that day. So we continue to plan, and yet you're in the midst of transition. Things have settled down in certain ways, and it feels like there's some traction gaining, and yet you're still not quite through that tunnel of wondering what is on the other side. And that's a little bit of the scene that gets set here as we look at the disciples. This passage goes very quickly, where the writer mentions this one phrase, on the evening of that first day of the week. Now, we're a week beyond Easter, but I could still feel some of the energy and the singing here of the congregation as we worship together, that we still have some of that celebration and the proclamation that Jesus has risen, that Jesus is alive, that we are not a leaderless congregation. We do have somebody that we're following, someone that is a victor. Now, this is the first day of the week, and if you go back to the beginning of chapter 20, it's also that first day when Mary Magdalene came to the tomb, along with some other women. She meets Jesus, and that's what is immediately before this, her coming to the disciples and saying, "I have seen the Lord." We're still talking about the same day. So that evening, here is the scene with the disciples gathered together with the doors locked for fear of the Jews. Huddled together, more in trepidation than any kind of elation that they know that Jesus is alive. And they're making sure that nobody can get in, at least not with some kind of advance warning. It's almost like they never heard Mary's proclamation. And the last half of this passage, it talks a good bit about Thomas, but Thomas is not the only one who's doubting. He's not the only one who's wondering, what is this going to be now that Jesus is not present with them? They're kind of gripped with a sense of uncertainty and fear. And we refer to that sometimes as a liminal space. We all go through them. It's those times in our lives where there is a definite before and a definite after, and that's kind of how we talk about them. And what makes them so difficult is that you know what is behind you. That was your experience. That was your story. That is what you navigated. That is what you figured out. And you figured out who you were. And now you're going through a time of transition. And those questions start to creep in, like, who am I going to be on the other side of this? I know some of you have retired from various kinds of positions. You have one identity that is built often around a career or where you work, and you know who that person is. You have a comfort level with it, but who am I going to be after? How about you that are graduating, especially those that might be graduating from college? So I was talking to one young woman. The fear wasn't about graduation day. That was a celebration of everything that she had known. The fear was, what's life going to be like when I don't have these peers with me all the time? When I don't have my life structured for me, that I kind of know how to do the academic route? What if I hate my job and I chose the wrong major? Who am I going to be? Will I be good at what I've chosen to do? Can I be honored in the workplace? There are so many different ways in which this hits us throughout our lifetime. The before it happened and the after. A marriage, what is life like before? What is it like after? A divorce, the before and the after. Who will we be after? A serious illness, taking on a new job, perhaps losing one that you've loved. These transition times are so difficult because they're basically about who we believe we are, our identity. Heston Mennonite is still a bit in that. You developed an identity around a group of pastors at one point that went for a really long time. And now you've been in a period of transition with some stability as you're going through it, but still wondering, who is Heston Mennonite on the other side of that? And will you define yourself by who pastors here? Or will you define yourself by who you as a congregation are called to be? Because it's pretty easy to not be present to a transition if we're just waiting for the next pastor to come. I think the most difficult part of being in the middle of a transition is being present. We get so worried about what is ahead that we're always projecting and trying to be ready for what might be coming. Or we're so unhappy or unsettled with being in the middle of it that we long, like the Israelites, oh, that we would have just stayed in Egypt. And we can't be present to the people who are right here around us. And it's in the middle of that Jesus suddenly appears, locks on the doors, but he appears to them. And his words are, peace be with you. And it's a peace that symbolizes the kind of suffering love that I offered to you. It's victorious. You can't beat it. Hate does not win. Love wins out. And he tells them to receive the Holy Spirit. He breathes on them. And this is like the idea of inflating, like a balloon. You know how that feels when somebody believes in you? I think of this particularly as a man, and I think this can be a real men's issue. Have you ever felt yourself, your chest get just a little full, or when a father, your father, maybe says something they appreciate about you to someone else? And you sense that somebody, your own father, taking a little bit of pride in you, and there's a way in which that brings courage up inside instead of fear. And I'll be honest, many of us have not known what that's like. But we long for that. We long for that kind of affirmation of the deepest sense of who we are as a person. And that is what this idea of breathing on the disciples, it's a throwback kind of to Genesis, where God fashioned Adam and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. It is something that enlivens and animates us, and it's the root of our courage in the face of fear. It changed them. I want to jump ahead to Acts chapter 4, verse 13, and listen to these words. When they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that this is identity here, they were unschooled, they were ordinary men, but yet they were astonished at what they saw in them. I don't know why, but this is what I think of. They're before the Jewish council. I think of myself as a little kid having Gilligan's Island interrupted by the Watergate hearings, which is like just a bunch of congressmen interviewing people, trying to get the facts out of what happened. They're all old, they look unhappy, and as a little kid, I never could imagine them as a little boy. Could those old guys possibly have ever been a little boy? There's like no sense of humor. And that's the way I kind of envision this council bringing Peter and John before them, trying to tell them to knock it off. You can't go around proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus. But they also can't tell them that because everybody's happy about this person that they have just healed. And it's like these grumpy men looking up and down the line at each other going, where did these guys come from? And one of them noted, oh, these guys were with Jesus. And it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like they're beginning to get it, that there is something here about that breathing of this new life, receiving the Holy Spirit, and these unschooled, ordinary men that are starting to turn the world upside down before their very eyes, even though they had been successful in killing their leader. This goes on in this passage to talk about Thomas. There's a painting that I want to show you that is from a painter named Caravaggio in the late 1500s, I think is where this is from, called The Incredulity of St. Thomas. And he's often, as I've said before, dubbed as the Doubting Thomas, even though everybody there had their doubts. Thomas, as you know, said, I'm not going to believe that you have seen Jesus, because he wasn't there that evening, that first night. He didn't see him. The disciples told him, the rest of the disciples and those that were there told him that they had seen Jesus. He said, I won't believe it unless I can put my hands in his side, unless I can feel the wounds in his hands. There's no way I'm going to buy it. So they are together 1 week later. A week has transpired. Now they've kind of caught up to us. They're a week post-Easter morning. The doors are still locked. So even though Jesus had given them that courage a week earlier, it's taking a little bit of time to take root. And Jesus appears again among them and invites Thomas to explore the wounds on his body. Stick your hand in my side. What I want you to notice about this image is that Jesus' body is wounded. I didn't really get that before. I've been a Christian a long time, and I just never really caught that. Like, I expect that when I die and I am given my heavenly, eternal body, whatever that is, that it's going to be perfect. But his body's not perfect. And it's not even a healed wound. If you can imagine pulling back flesh and being able to stick fingers inside or hand inside a spear wound, it's not a closed up scar. And through the writings of a woman named Debbie Thomas, I want to give her credit for this. In her blog on Journey with Jesus, she talks about this in a way that it's like, yeah, there is something really important about that. Because if Jesus is wounded, could it be he doesn't expect us to be perfect? Because we can belong to churches. I've been there. I've done it myself. We can get into these habits of like trying to work so hard to be righteous that we just choke the life out of ourselves, and we can't really be honest about the wounds that we have and find a way to meet each other and meet the risen Christ in them. But is it possible that this resurrection is about a holy God not meeting a perfect person, but a holy God meeting the brokenness of humanity? That's a whole different way to look at holiness for me than I really have ever quite grasped before. Because if Jesus did not have that wound, he would not have been able to be so convincing to Thomas to say, I was the one that was hanging on that tree. See the marks? They're still here. And it's a way of affirming Jesus' presence with Thomas and the disciples and with us. That identity of Christ is one and the same. He hasn't changed. He is still there in that brokenness of humanity. He's still there willing to embrace all the ugliness of this place that we see sometimes. And he's there to transform it into something beautiful, not to erase it. There are times, I think, for all of us that we'd like to pretend that there's things in our lives that just aren't there. And we can tend to separate ourselves from them, and we can keep them in a box, would be one metaphor. Or we keep them in a room in our house that is away from the living room, and we don't ever let Jesus go with us there. We don't let anybody go with us there. And I think Jesus' wounds are a way, as Debbie Thomas writes, as she says, some wounds are for keeps. There's some things that we just don't get rid of. And we also don't heal from them if we don't ever bring them out of the box, or if we don't ever bring them out of that upstairs room, because we don't feel like it's safe. They were gathered together because that's our basic human need. They wanted to feel safe. They wanted to be with people who get them, who understand their same language. And that's one of our greatest fears, is that we have something in our past, or we're struggling with something that nobody else will get this. Nobody else is going to understand this. It's like, thank God that Jesus rose from the dead so that at least someday this is going to be healed in my past. Trying to be present with each other in the middle of transition requires us to be able to bring the past with us, to really find a way to be whole. Not perfect. We will still carry our scars. And I want to read you a story about it's an account from a woman named Gail. She is somebody who was traumatized as a child because she had tremendous abuse in her home that she experienced from her father, brothers, and uncle. And I want to read you her account because I feel like it captures the way in which we can live a life that is separated into different selves, that if we can bring them out into the light of the resurrection, of the wounded Christ, that there is hope and healing in that. She says, I remember clearly creating boxes in my head, and I put the stuff that happened to me in those boxes and I shut their lids. For years, I had a completely other fantasy world And when things got rough, I went over to that world and hid in those boxes with no outside handles. A very distinct world. I was a different person with different names. Everything was different. It was of my own making. But it got to the point where I couldn't make choices about whether to be here or there. They both became crazy. And I wasn't sure where I was anymore. And then came a very dramatic point in my healing. I became a Christian, and while I was praying, I felt those boxes were not a good place to go. I felt I had the power to make the decision not to go there anymore. And if I made that decision, then I could be free from that. I remember literally arguing with God, saying, but that means I have to stay here all the time. I made the choice to stay in the real world, but I remember being really angry at God. I was about 16. She goes on to say, I've decided that what happened to me can become my gift or my albatross, and I'm the only one that can choose. I'll never be thankful for what happened. I wouldn't choose this route again, but I'm thankful for what I've learned from it, the gifts it has given me, the insights, the compassion. The grace of God is something I'm beginning to search out and understand. Grace for me and grace to me. My belief in God and my relationship with God is so foundational, I don't see any meaning without it. And she touches on something there. It's like, how do we make meaning of what is in our past? It's core to who we believe we are. And this is just so honest. She says, one of the battles I went through was with the Bible, where it talks about how Jesus is touched by our feelings. I thought, no, he wasn't a little girl in my home. He can't possibly know. Eventually, I realized that it was at Calvary that he got it. That's where he bore not just my sin, but my pain, and he bore the offender's sin. He knew what it was like to be me. That's when I began to trust that he could understand that I could go to the Lord with this stuff. It was when he took on the mystery of the cross that he got it. That's when he knew. I wish I could put into words the depth of how that hit me. I want people to know that there's hope, that there's nothing too dark, nothing that has to be left in the darkness and hidden. I really want people to know that everything can be brought out. Hope is such a big word for me. I like words like restoration, for they speak to that. I like the word transcendence. It fits. I feel like I live in a totally other place than where I came from. My past is still part of me, and as much as I wouldn't choose it again, I wouldn't trade it. I don't know how to reconcile those two thoughts, but I wouldn't be who I am without my past. And it's taken me a long time to get where I am now. Where the disciples were gathered, the doors were locked for fear of the Jews. What makes you bar the door? What makes you lock the door to find a safe place? and to try to find comfort or forget about what is on the other side. The disciples eventually went through that barred door. And think about this. Nothing on the outside of that door had changed. But there was a metamorphosis, a transformation that happened inside of them that got them to the place where they could own who they were. Peter could own that he had denied Christ 3 times. Mary Magdalene could accept her past and learn from it, and I'm guessing use it to minister to other people who had a similar experience. I think of that often with those of you who have lost spouses, that I haven't experienced that, and I know there isn't anything like being able to talk to somebody else who's also lost a spouse, because you can say, look, here's my wound. You can feel it. Everything about us and our past and what we deal with now can be brought to Christ, not because it's about a resurrection of perfection. It's about a resurrection of taking us right where we are and transforming us into something brand new. So today, as you leave here, nothing has changed outside those doors much. But could we be transformed in here as we go out those doors today, knowing that it is Jesus that believes in you, accepts you for all of your scars and wounds, and wants to breathe that life into you, that I am proud of you, you are my beloved, let's work together and bring the good news to this community and to others who struggle in these stories that we have. They have their own. Because when we can do that, we can be present to each other and present to those that we come across in our daily lives in a way that hiding a past or hiding part of ourselves won't ever allow us to. I don't want to be a part of a church that chokes itself on righteousness. I want to be a part of a church where you see holy ground as the place where a holy God meets a broken humanity for each one of you. So Jesus, lead on.